Welcome to our deep dive today. We're going to be looking at some articles about the Kennedy assassination from the Kennedy Assassination Chronicles magazine.
Yeah, it's amazing how much stuff, new stuff still comes out on this topic.
So we'll be taking a look at a review of a JFK research conference, and then some stuff about Lee Harvey Oswald's trip to Helsinki before he went to the Soviet Union, um, and also some claims that JFK opposed globalist interests. And also, we'll be looking at the New Frontier, and we'll finish up with a discussion of the man impersonating a Secret Service agent after the shooting in Dealey Plaza.
Yeah, I think through all these years, it makes you think, why is the JFK assassination still such a big deal? It's been a long time, but I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that there's still a lot of unanswered questions. There's a sense that something's not quite right, and I think for a lot of people, it represents kind of a turning point in American history. Sort of a loss of innocence or a descent into cynicism.
Let's get started by taking a look at that conference review. This one is a review of a 2000 conference called November in Dallas.
Yeah, these November in Dallas conferences, they've become a really big deal for people who are deep into the JFK assassination research. And they bring together people from all sorts of different fields. Like you've got medical professionals, historians, forensic scientists, all coming together to present their research and discuss different theories. And this particular conference in 2000, it was especially noteworthy because it had some presentations that really directly challenged the Warren Commission's findings.
Wow. So tell me, what were some of the biggest takeaways from the conference?
Well, one of the most startling revelations came from Dr. Ronald Jones. And he was actually one of the physicians who treated JFK at Parkland Hospital. He gave a firsthand account of the president's wounds. And he specifically described a small round entry wound in the throat and a massive defect at the back of the head. Now, these observations were shared by other Parkland doctors at the time as well, but they directly contradict the official autopsy report, which placed that fatal head wound much higher up.
Wait, so you're telling me that the doctors who were right there treating JFK saw something totally different than what ended up in the official report? That's terrifying. What's going on there?
It's a big discrepancy that raises serious questions about, the integrity of the evidence. And adding to these doubts is Stuart Gallinor. He's the author of Cover Up. And he presented an analysis of the impossible shot trajectories proposed by the Warren Commission. He basically argued that the official explanation just doesn't line up with the physical evidence and the witness testimony.
Can we dig into those trajectories for a sec? Like, what made them impossible?
Yeah, so Gallinor pointed out a really fundamental contradiction. If all the shots came from behind, like the Warren Commission said, then how could JFK have been shot in the throat from the front? And if the fatal headshot came from the Texas School Book Depository, like the official story goes, why does the trajectory, when you line it up with JFK's head position in the Zapruder film, why does it point upwards? It just doesn't make sense.
That's a huge problem with the official story. Did the conference look into that more?
Yeah. Dr. David Mantik, who is a radiation oncologist and a physicist, actually presented even more evidence that suggests that the official narrative is flawed. He analyzed the autopsy x-rays, and he found what he believes to be clear indications of fabrication. He presented evidence of a patch that concealed the large defect at the back of JFK's head. And he also pointed to a 6.5 millimeter metal object that appears to have been added to another x-ray. So this all points to a deliberate attempt to manipulate the evidence to fit a predetermined conclusion.
Fabricated x-rays is getting crazy. Sounds like this conference wasn't shying away from anything.
Not at all. And one of the big themes that ran through the whole conference was information suppression and the struggles that researchers face when they try to challenge the official story. Noel Twyman, the author of Bloody Treason, and Peter Dale Scott, who's written a lot about the JFK assassination, talked about how hard it's been to get their research out there and recognized. They argued that there's a real resistance to accepting anything that suggests the government might have been involved either in the assassination itself or in a cover-up.
It makes you wonder, why is it so hard to get these alternative ideas out there? Is it all about the influence of the official narrative? Or is something else going on?
Well, it's complicated. Part of it is just human nature, right? We don't want to believe that our own government could be capable of something so horrific. But there are also powerful forces within the government and the media that are very invested in keeping things the way they are. When you challenge the official narrative, you're threatening their authority and their control.
So there were also some really interesting details about Lee Harvey Oswald, especially about that trip he took to Helsinki in 1959. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, this was one of the most fascinating presentations. It was given by Ian Griggs, a British researcher and author who specializes in this early period of Oswald's life. He focused on Oswald's stay at these two really expensive hotels in Helsinki, the Hotel Torni and the Hotel Klaus Kirke. Now, this was pretty strange because Oswald didn't have a lot of money. So it raises the question, who was paying for his trip and why?
Wow. Expensive hotels, mystery sponsors. This is starting to sound like a spy movie. What's the deal with these hotels? What made them so significant?
Well, the Hotel Tornia has a really interesting history, a history that's kind of intertwined with espionage. During World War II, it was rumored to be a hub for Allied spies. And then after the war, it was taken over by Soviet authorities. It became the headquarters of the Allied Control Commission. So Oswald staying there adds this whole other layer of intrigue to the story.
So Oswald was hanging out in a hotel with connections to both Western and Soviet intelligence. That's a huge red flag. What do you make of that?
It definitely suggests that there might be more to Oswald than meets the eye. His movements, his contacts, even his choice of accommodation, it all hints at the possibility that he was being manipulated by forces beyond his control.
Makes you wonder what was really going on during that trip and how it might connect back to the assassination. Were there any other details about his time in Helsinki that stood out?
Well, this is where things get even more interesting. Griggs pointed out that a lot of the hotel records from Oswald's stay have vanished. They're just gone. And this makes it really hard to piece together what happened during those crucial days. The lack of documentation just adds to the suspicion that Oswald was involved in something a lot more complicated than we've been led to believe.
So it sounds like someone deliberately tried to erase Oswald's tracks, or at least make it really hard to follow them. That can't be a coincidence.
You know, that's the thing about the JFK assassination. It's full of coincidences. But the question is, are they really coincidences, or are they part of a bigger plan?
Okay, let's switch gears a bit and talk about another controversial aspect of the assassination. The claim that JFK was targeted because he opposed powerful globalist interests. This theory tends to get dismissed as a fringe conspiracy theory, but it's fascinating to see it discussed in this magazine.
It is, and I think it's important to remember that the JFK assassination happened during a really tense time in history. You know, the Cold War was at its peak, the Vietnam War was escalating, and there were major power struggles happening all over the world. So it's not out of the realm of possibility that JFK's policies might have upset some very influential people.
So what exactly were these policies that supposedly put JFK at odds with these globalist forces?
Well, Jim Marrs, who wrote the book Crossfire, lays out a pretty compelling case in his article. He focuses on JFK's economic policies, which really challenged the status quo. JFK was proposing some pretty significant tax reforms that were designed to redirect foreign investments by U.S. companies, close tax loopholes that benefited global investment companies, and crack down on the use of foreign tax havens. He was basically taking aim at the financial elite. And on top of that, he rejected proposals to eliminate tax breaks for the wealthy and even authorized the U.S. Treasury to issue billions of dollars in United States notes instead of relying on the Federal Reserve.
Wow, those are some bold moves, especially taking on the Federal Reserve. You're right, that would have created some very powerful enemies. What was the reaction to these policies?
Well, as you might imagine, there was a lot of pushback. Marrs details how Kennedy's economic policies were publicly criticized by some very influential figures, people like Fortune magazine editor Charles J.V. Murphy, New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller, David Rockefeller, even the Wall Street Journal. And get this, even Kennedy's own Treasury Secretary, Douglas Dillon, who is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, opposed these policies.
Wow, someone within Kennedy's own administration opposed these reforms. That really says something about the influence of these globalist interests. Did Marr's article talk about JFK's foreign policy at all?
It did. Marrs argues that Kennedy's foreign policy, specifically his reluctance to send ground troops into Vietnam, also put him at odds with powerful forces who wanted greater military intervention. Remember, this was a time when the military-industrial complex, as President Eisenhower called it, was gaining a lot of power. Kennedy's reluctance to escalate the war in Vietnam was a direct threat to their profits and their agenda.
So we're seeing a pattern here. Both in his domestic and foreign policies, JFK was challenging powerful, entrenched interests. It makes you wonder if his assassination was a way to get him out of the picture and make sure their plans could move forward without him.
That's a conclusion that a lot of researchers have reached, and Marrs's article definitely supports that theory. He even goes into the possible role of secret societies like the Council on Foreign Relations in shaping events before and after the assassination. These organizations, with their vast networks of influence and their commitment to a globalist agenda, have long been suspected of playing a role in major world events, and the JFK assassination is no exception.
So we have a president who challenged the economic and military establishment and maybe even interfered with some powerful globalist agendas. It definitely paints a picture of a man who's making some dangerous enemies. But how much of this is actually true?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? There's no smoking gun that definitively proves that JFK was assassinated because he opposed these globalist interests. But there is a lot of circumstantial evidence that warrants further investigation. The fact that so many powerful individuals and organizations benefited from JFK's death, along with the constant efforts to cover up the truth about the assassination, casts a very long shadow over the official narrative.
It's a lot to consider. Even if we can't conclusively say that these globalist forces were behind the assassination, it's pretty clear that they had a lot to gain from it. And they definitely had the means and motive to make it happen.
That's an important point. When we're looking at historical events, it's vital to look beyond the surface and ask who benefited, who had the power to influence events, and who might have had a reason to hide the truth.
This deep dive is already giving me so much to think about. I'm seeing the JFK assassination in a whole new light. It's not just a tragic event. It's a tangled web of political intrigue, hidden agendas, and unanswered questions.
And that's what makes it so captivating, right? It forces us to think critically, to question what we've been told, and to consider perspectives that might be uncomfortable or even disturbing. The JFK assassination is a stark reminder that history is rarely as simple as it seems, and that the search for truth can be a long and winding road.
Okay, this is all pretty heavy stuff. Maybe we can take a break from the darkness for a minute and talk about something a little more hopeful. JFK's new frontier ideals. I've always been fascinated by the sense of optimism and possibility that he inspired, especially among young people.
Yeah, Kennedy had this remarkable ability to articulate a vision of a brighter future, a future where America would lead the world, not through military might, but through service, innovation, and cooperation. His new frontier wasn't just a set of policies, it was a call to action, a challenge for Americans to push beyond their comfort zones and strive for something greater.
That phrase, a call to action, really captures it perfectly. So what were some of the core elements of his new frontier vision?
Well, Kerry McCarthy, who's a relative of JFK and a family historian, offers a really insightful perspective on this in his article. He highlights Kennedy's focus on education. Kennedy believed that Americans should embrace intellectual growth and pursue knowledge as a path to progress. And he also underscores Kennedy's belief in individual responsibility and self-reliance. He wanted Americans to take an active role in shaping their destinies and contributing to the greater good.
So on one hand, you have these shadowy forces working behind the scenes, and on the other hand, you have Kennedy saying that individuals have the power to make a difference. How do you reconcile those two things?
That's a really interesting question. I think it speaks to this inherent tension in Kennedy's vision. He truly believed that individuals could make a difference, but he also recognized that there were systemic forces at play that could hinder progress and limit what individuals could achieve. His new frontier was, in part, an attempt to empower individuals to overcome these systemic barriers and create a more just and equitable society.
That message continues to be relevant today. But there's also a sense of tragedy there, knowing that Kennedy himself ultimately became a victim of the very forces he was trying to challenge.
It's definitely a tragic aspect of the story. It makes you wonder what could have been if Kennedy had lived to fully realize his vision. But even in the short time he was president, he accomplished quite a bit, both domestically and internationally.
What were some of the specific things that Kennedy did that really embodied his new frontier ideals?
McCarthy points to the creation of the Peace Corps as a prime example of Kennedy's commitment to global engagement through service. This program, which sends American volunteers to developing countries to work on all sorts of projects, really embodies that spirit of cooperation and cross-cultural understanding that Kennedy championed. He also highlights the signing of the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty as a major achievement in Kennedy's effort to prevent nuclear war and promote peace. This treaty, which was signed by the United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom, was a major step towards easing global tensions and preventing a nuclear catastrophe.
Those are really impressive accomplishments. It shows that Kennedy was able to put his vision into action. But honestly, it's his rhetoric, his eloquence, that really gets to me. He had a way with words that could move people, inspire them to believe in something bigger than themselves.
Absolutely. Kennedy was a master communicator. His speeches are still studied and admired for their power and relevance today. He understood that language has a profound impact on how we see the world and how we come together to achieve common goals. His ability to connect with people on an emotional level, to make them feel like they were part of something historic, was a big part of why he was such a successful leader.
That's something that seems to be missing in a lot of today's leaders. There's a certain authenticity, a genuine passion in Kennedy's words that's hard to find these days.
I agree. That authenticity was what made Kennedy so compelling. People could tell that he truly believed in what he was saying. He wasn't just reading talking points, he spoke from the heart. And that resonated with people across the political spectrum.
I've always felt that when Kennedy was assassinated, America lost something precious, a sense of possibility of idealism. And we've been struggling to get it back ever since.
There's definitely a sense of loss, a feeling that something shifted in the American psyche after that day in Dallas. But I do believe that Kennedy's legacy continues to inspire us. It reminds us that even in the face of enormous challenges, we can choose hope over despair and strive for a better future, even if it seems impossible.
I like that, choosing hope over despair. It feels incredibly relevant right now, given all the challenges we're facing.
It does, doesn't it? Kennedy's message of courage, resilience, and dedication to the common good feels more timely than ever. We can draw inspiration from his example, even as we acknowledge the complexities and tragedies of his life and his death.
So far, this deep dive has taken us on quite a journey. We've gone from examining medical evidence to discussing global power struggles to reflecting on the inspiring ideals of Kennedy's new frontier. It's been a whirlwind, and we're not done yet. Next up, we'll dive into one of the most perplexing mysteries of the JFK assassination, the mysterious Secret Service agent on the grassy knoll.
This is where things get really interesting. Several witnesses reported seeing a man who claimed to be a Secret Service agent on the grassy knoll right after the shooting. But here's the catch. There were no Secret Service agents assigned to that area. So the big question is, who was this guy and what was he doing there?
All right, now we're getting into some real cloak and dagger territory. This is the kind of stuff that conspiracy theories are made of. What do the articles tell us about this mystery man?
Well, Daroga Conway, who's done some really meticulous research on this, takes a deep dive into this mystery in her article. She looks at witness statements, official records, and all the different theories that have been put forward over the years. And what she finds paints a really intriguing picture. It's captivating, but ultimately it's inconclusive.
Before we get into the theories, I want to hear about those witness statements. What did these people actually see?
One of the most compelling accounts comes from Dallas police officer Joseph Smith. He actually encountered this mystery man just moments after the shooting. Smith said he approached the guy with his gun drawn, but the man showed him what looked like a Secret Service badge. So he convinced Smith that he was a legitimate law enforcement officer.
That's incredibly brazen. To impersonate a Secret Service agent right after the president has been shot.
Yeah.
It takes a lot of nerve and confidence to pull that off. Were there any other witnesses who saw this guy?
Yeah, there were. A post office employee named J.C. Price reported seeing a man who matched the agent's description running away from the grassy knoll right after the shooting. And Lee Bowers, Jr., who had a clear view of the area from his position in a train observation tower, he also saw two suspicious men near the fence before the assassination, and one of them fit the description of the guy that Officer Smith encountered.
So, multiple witnesses saw this agent in the area, both before and after the shooting. This is definitely more than just a coincidence. Did the articles offer any explanations for why this guy was there?
They did. Conway looked into several different possibilities, some more plausible than others. The possibilities range from legitimate law enforcement officers who were just in the wrong place at the wrong time to more sinister figures who might have been involved in the assassination plot.
Okay, let's start with the more plausible explanations. Could this guy have been a real Secret Service agent who was just out of position?
That was one theory. But the House Select Committee on Assassinations, they investigated the assassination back in the 1970s, and they didn't find any evidence to support that theory. They interviewed all the Secret Service agents who were on duty that day, and they found that none of them were supposed to be on the grassy knoll. The only agent who left the motorcade before they got to the hospital was Thomas Lem Johns, who was riding in Vice President Johnson's car, and even he was quickly picked up and taken to the hospital.
So if it wasn't a Secret Service agent, could it have been a cop? Like someone from the Dallas Police Department?
That's another possibility that Conway looked into. The Dallas PD had a lot of plainclothes detectives in Bealey Plaza that day, so it's possible that Officer Smith just mistook one of them for a Secret Service agent, especially given how chaotic everything was.
In all the confusion, it makes sense that someone could get mixed up. Did the House Select Committee consider that possibility?
They did. But according to Dallas police records, none of their plainclothes detectives were assigned to the grassy knoll. And even if one of them wandered over there for some reason, it still doesn't explain why they would tell Officer Smith they were Secret Service. It just doesn't add up.
Okay, so we can rule out the Secret Service and the Dallas police. What about the FBI? Weren't they involved in the investigation?
They were, but the House Select Committee ruled them out too. They found that none of the FBI agents were near the grassy knoll during the assassination.
All right, so if he wasn't Secret Service, Dallas PD, or FBI, then who was this guy? We're running out of options here.
I know, right? And this is where things get really intriguing. Conway explores some less conventional possibilities. One of them is a possible connection to the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Bureau, which was called the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax Division back then.
Wait, the ATF? What would they have to do with the assassination?
It's a really interesting connection. It all hinges on the testimony of a former FBI agent named James Hosty. Hosty told the House Select Committee that an ATF agent named Frank Ellsworth had told him that he had been on the grassy knoll and that he had told people he was Secret Service.
Now, this is starting to sound like a conspiracy. Did Ellsworth admit to this when he was questioned by the committee?
Nope. He denied it. He said that Hosty was lying. But there is evidence that Ellsworth was in Dealey Plaza that day, and he and 7 other ATS agents were among the first law enforcement officers to reach the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository after the shooting.
That's really strange. If Ellsworth was there, why would he lie about it? And why would he pretend to be a Secret Service agent? It seems like he was hiding something.
It does, doesn't it? This raises more questions than answers. What were all these ATF agents doing in Dealey Plaza that day? Their presence definitely adds another layer of mystery to this whole Knoll agent story.
So the ATF connection is interesting, but it still doesn't give us a definitive answer. Are there any other theories that Conway explores in her article?
There's one more, and it's probably the most intriguing of them all. A possible link to Army intelligence.
Wait, Army intelligence. Now we're getting into some serious conspiracy territory. What's the evidence for this?
The Army intelligence angle comes from the testimony of Colonel Robert Jones, who was in charge of the 112th Military Intelligence Group back in 1963. Jones told the House Select Committee that his unit sent a small team of plainclothes agents to Dallas to help with security for the president's visit. He estimated that there were between 8 and 12 of these agents, all dressed in civilian clothes.
Hold on a minute. The Army had undercover intelligence agents operating in Dallas during the assassination, and no one ever officially acknowledged it. It's a huge bombshell.
It is, and it really makes you question just how much secrecy and covert activity was going on at that time. Jones testified that these agents would have had identification, but that they were probably told to say they were on detail to the Secret Service, if anyone asked. He also said that they might have worn a special signal or code so they could be identified in a crowd.
So you're saying it's possible that one of these Army intelligence guys was the Knoll agent who Officer Smith talked to. Did the committee try to find these agents?
They did, but when they asked the Department of Defense for information, they were told that there were no records indicating any Department of Defense protective services in Dallas. The committee couldn't resolve this contradiction, and so the identities of these Army intelligence agents remain a mystery.
Ugh, that's so frustrating. It feels like every time we get close to the truth, there's another wall of secrecy blocking our way. What are they so afraid of us finding out?
I know, right? The fact that the Department of Defense denied that these agents were even there, even after their commanding officer testified under oath about them, suggests that someone was actively trying to hide their activities. And that just makes the whole thing even more suspicious.
This Army intelligence connection is fascinating, but it's also a lot to take in. We've gone from a simple case of mistaken identity to a potential web of covert operations involving multiple government agencies. I don't even know what to believe at this point.
And that's the nature of this case, right? It's just a tangled mess of conflicting information, hidden agendas, and unanswered questions. Conway's article might not solve the mystery of the Knoll agent, but it shows just how unsettling it is to think about what else might have been going on that day. Forces that we still don't understand.
It's almost like peering into this deep, dark abyss and catching glimpses of things that are both captivating and terrifying. It makes you question how much we really know about our own history. about the forces that shape our world.
That's the power of the JFK assassination. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, secrecy, and the possibility of corruption at the highest levels. It reminds us that the official story isn't always the whole story, and that finding the truth often means questioning everything we thought we knew.
I think we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive. We've looked at evidence that doesn't line up, considered the possibility that Oswald was being manipulated by forces we don't know about, discussed the idea that JFK was killed because he threatened powerful interests, and gone deep into the mystery of the Knoll agent. It's been a lot of information, and honestly, I have more questions now than when we started.
Yeah, that's to be expected with a case as complex and controversial as this one. But I think it's important to be okay with not having all the answers, to acknowledge that there are things we don't know and might never know. It's in that space of uncertainty that we can really start to think critically, question what we've been told, and explore different perspectives.
You're right. It's the mystery, the unanswered questions, that keeps us coming back to this event. It's endlessly fascinating.
Absolutely. The JFK assassination isn't just a historical event. It's a puzzle, a challenge to our understanding of the world. And like any good puzzle, it requires us to look at the pieces carefully, to search for patterns, and to consider all the possibilities, even the ones that seem far-fetched. Only then can we start to see the bigger picture.
Well, I don't know about you, but I need a minute to process all of this. When we come back, we'll continue our deep dive into the JFK assassination, exploring even more intriguing details and fascinating theories from the Kennedy Assassination Chronicles. Stay tuned. Welcome back to our deep dive into the Kennedy assassination. Before we took a moment to collect our thoughts, we were discussing some of the more baffling aspects of the assassination, particularly that mysterious Secret Service agent on the grassy knoll. We talked about how various law enforcement agencies were ruled out as possibilities, and it leaves us with a pretty unsettling question. If this man wasn't a legitimate officer, then who was he? And what was his role in the events of that day?
It's a question that continues to intrigue and puzzle researchers, even after all this time. And Deeper Conway, in her article, she really digs deep into this, examining witness testimonies, following potential leads, and while she doesn't give us a definitive answer, she does leave us with some really thought-provoking possibilities.
Speaking of thought-provoking possibilities, we haven't even touched on James W. Powell, an Army intelligence agent who was actually in Dealey Plaza on November 22nd, 1963. His presence just adds another layer to this Knoll agent mystery.
Oh, that's right. Powell's name has come up a few times, and for good reason. He's the one who took that famous picture of the Texas School Book Depository just moments after the shooting, the one that shows the entire length of the building.
Yeah, and that photograph, along with Powell's account of what he was doing that day, makes it seem pretty unlikely that he was the Knoll agent. After all, he was busy taking pictures. But the fact that he was there in Dealey Plaza as an Army intelligence officer, and then his testimony to the Assassination Records Review Board, or ARRB for short, it definitely raises some questions.
The ARB was established back in the 1990s to oversee the release of government documents related to the assassination. They interviewed a ton of witnesses and people who were involved in the original investigation, including James Powell.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that. So, going back to Powell, what exactly was he doing in Dealey Plaza that day? Was he there on official business, or was he just a spectator like everyone else?
Well, that's where things get a little murky. Powell told the ARRB that he had asked for the day off from work so he could see the motorcade and, as he put it, hopefully get a few pictures. He said he didn't know anything about any security plans or anything related to the president's visit.
So he's saying he was just a regular guy, a tourist with a camera.
Yeah.
But given his background in Army intelligence, it's hard to believe he wasn't at least a little bit aware of the security measures that would be in place for a presidential visit.
I agree. And it gets even more suspicious when you consider that his commanding officer, Colonel Jones, testified that Powell was actually on duty that day.
Wait, so we have Powell saying he was off duty and his commanding officer saying he was on duty. That's a pretty big contradiction. Did the ARRB address this?
They did, but it just made the whole thing even more mysterious. During his interview with the ARRB, Powell was asked directly if he remembered any discussions or activities within the 112th Intelligence Group that had to do with providing security for the president. And he just said no.
So he's denying that he had anything to do with security operations, even though his commanding officer said otherwise. It sounds like he was trying to distance himself from any official role in what happened that day. Is it possible that he was compartmentalized? Like he only knew a small piece of what was going on?
That's definitely a possibility. Intelligence operations often involve a lot of secrecy and compartmentalization, so it's possible that Powell only knew about his specific assignment and not the bigger picture.
Okay, let's just say for argument's sake that Powell was on duty that day, but he wasn't involved in protecting the president. What other kinds of tasks might he have been assigned?
Well, according to what he told the ARRB, Powell's usual job involved conducting security investigations and background checks on military and civilian personnel, especially people who worked on sensitive projects like missile bases. He also had special training in investigative photography, which he called an additional skill that he didn't use very often.
Interesting. So could he have been in Dealey Plaza doing some kind of surveillance, like keeping an eye on someone that Army intelligence was interested in?
It's definitely possible. Remember, this was the height of the Cold War, and there was a lot of anxiety about potential threats to national security, both inside and outside the U.S. It's conceivable that Army intelligence had identified individuals or groups in Dallas they were worried about, and Powell might have been there to keep tabs on them.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
Huh?
But how does this connect back to the Knoll agent mystery? Was Powell considered a suspect?
He was, but if you look at the timing of his actions and his own account of what he was doing that day, it's highly unlikely that he was the man Officer Smith encountered on the grassy knoll. We talked earlier about how Powell testified that he stopped to take a picture of the Texas School Book Depository right after the shooting. He also said that he was with a bunch of law enforcement officers who he called sheriffs when he was in the parking lot behind the building.
Right, so if you're looking at the timeline, Powell would have been busy taking pictures and talking to those other officers right around the time that Officer Smith was talking to the Knoll agent.
Exactly. And there's another important detail that makes it even less likely that Powell was involved. He had his camera with him the whole time. Officer Smith never mentioned seeing a camera when he described the Knoll agent. I doubt he would have forgotten such a distinctive detail, especially in a situation like that.
You're right, that's a pretty big detail to leave out. So if we can rule out Powell as the Knoll agent, what does his presence in Dealey Plaza tell us? Is there anything important about his testimony, or is it just another dead end in this already super complicated case?
I don't think we should dismiss his testimony so quickly. While it might not solve the Knoll agent mystery, it does raise some serious questions about what Army intelligence was doing in the lead-up to the assassination. His denials, his conflicting statements about whether he was on duty or not, and the fact that the Department of Defense wouldn't even admit that other Army intelligence agents were in Dallas, it all points to a level of secrecy and cover-up that's hard to ignore.
It's like they're trying to hide something, trying to keep us from seeing the whole picture. And the more they try to cover things up, the more suspicious it all becomes.
Exactly. It can be so frustrating trying to research the JFK assassination. Every time you feel like you're getting close to the truth, you hit another wall of secrecy, another layer of obfuscation. It's a constant battle against those who would rather keep the past buried.
It's funny you should say that about buried secrets. One thing that stuck with me from that conference review we talked about was this recurring theme of information suppression. How researchers are having a hard time getting their findings accepted by the public and the media. Makes you wonder what other secrets might be hiding in all those files related to the JFK assassination.
I know, it's an exciting thought, right? Millions of pages of documents have been released over the years, but there are still these huge gaps in our understanding of what happened before, during, and after this assassination. And those gaps, well, they just fuel speculation, conspiracy theories, and this feeling that we might never really know the truth.
It's like this historical black hole. It sucks in all our attention, all our efforts to make sense of it. But ultimately, we're left with more questions than answers. But even though we're facing all this uncertainty, I still think it's important to keep searching, keep asking questions, and not let the past be rewritten or forgotten.
Absolutely. Trying to find the truth is a never-ending process, especially when you're dealing with events that have had such a massive impact on our country. The JFK assassination wasn't just a tragedy, it was a turning point, a moment that continues to shape our understanding of power, politics, and how fragile democracy really is.
It's a legacy that we're still living with today, even as we try to understand its complexities and all the unanswered questions. It reminds us that history isn't just something we read about in textbooks. It's a living force that shapes our present and our future.
And it's a force that we need to engage with thoughtfully, critically, and always, always keep looking for the truth. no matter where it takes us.
That's powerful. It leads to an important question, though.
Yeah.
If we accept that the official story might not be the whole story, how do we navigate this maze of information and misinformation about the JFK assassination? How do we figure out what to believe?
That's a fantastic question. It gets to the core of what historical research is all about, especially when you're dealing with something as controversial as this. You have to remember that a lot of what's presented as fact is really just interpretation. And those interpretations are based on the evidence that's available, which might be incomplete or even manipulated. It's like trying to put together a puzzle when some of the pieces are missing and some of the pieces might not even belong to that puzzle.
So where do we even start? Do we just give up and say it's too confusing? Or is there a way to approach this in a clear and organized way?
There is a way, and it involves looking at things from different angles. First, we have to recognize that there's not just one right answer to the JFK assassination puzzle. There are multiple perspectives, different interpretations, and a bunch of theories, and each one has its strengths and weaknesses.
So it's not about finding the answer. It's more about exploring the possibilities with an open mind. But how do we decide which possibilities are worth looking into?
That's a great question. This is where critical thinking comes in. We need to really look at our sources and think about whether they're credible, whether they might be biased, and whether their claims are backed up by evidence.
So even if a source seems reliable, we shouldn't just take their word for it. We need to question things, analyze the information, and cross-reference it to come to our own conclusions.
Exactly. And this is super important when we're dealing with information online, where misinformation and conspiracy theories can spread like wildfire. We need to be looking for sources that cite their sources, provide actual evidence for their claims, and are transparent about how they arrived at their conclusions.
Makes sense. It's all about having a healthy dose of skepticism and learning how to be discerning about the information we consume. But let's be real. Even if you have the best intentions, it's easy to get lost in all the details with a case like this. There's just so much information, so many conflicting accounts, and so many strongly held opinions. How do we avoid getting overwhelmed and stay focused?
I hear you. It's a valid concern. It's important to remember that you don't have to become an expert on every aspect of the JFK assassination to form an informed opinion. Start by focusing on what you're most interested in, whether it's the medical evidence, Oswald's past, or the different conspiracy theories.
So pick one area to focus on, really dive deep into that, and then go from there, breaking down a complex topic into smaller, more manageable chunks.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to change your mind as you come across new information or different perspectives. The great thing about historical research is that it's a continuous journey of discovery. There's always something new to learn, more to question, and more to uncover.
That's what makes this whole thing so captivating. It's a puzzle that never really ends, always changing with each new piece of information or insight.
I couldn't agree more. And by embracing these complexities, by accepting that there might not be clear-cut answers, we can develop a much deeper understanding, not just of the JFK assassination, but also the historical forces that have shaped our world and that continue to influence us today.
Okay, so we've talked about the challenges of sorting through all the information, but how can we apply this critical thinking to the articles from Kennedy Assassination Chronicles? After all, those are our main focus in this deep dive.
It's important to remember that these articles, just like any other source, need to be approached with a critical eye. They were written by individual researchers, each with their own points of view and areas of expertise. So even though these authors have done a lot of research and present some compelling arguments, it's still important for us to evaluate their claims carefully.
Got it. So we shouldn't just take their word for it. Even though it's in a publication like Kennedy Assassination Chronicles, we should still be looking for evidence, thinking about alternative explanations, and forming our own conclusions based on what's presented.
Exactly. It's about actively engaging with these articles, questioning the author's assumptions, and considering any biases that might be influencing their interpretations. For example, when we're reading Jim Mars's article about how JFK opposed globalist interests, we can appreciate his knowledge, but also think about whether his focus on that particular angle might be causing him to overlook other important factors.
Right, that's a good point. It's like we need to put on our detective hats, look at the clues, and consider all the angles before making any judgments.
Exactly. And by doing that, we not only gain a better understanding of the JFK assassination, but we also improve our critical thinking skills, which are super important for navigating this crazy, complex world we live in.
Speaking of navigating complexity, I'm realizing that we've spent a lot of time focused on the null agent mystery and all the challenges of historical research. We kind of got sidetracked from JFK's New Frontier ideals and what impact they had.
You're right, we did kind of get lost in the weeds of evidence and interpretations. But it's important to remember that the JFK assassination wasn't just about shadowy figures and unanswered questions. It was also about losing a truly visionary leader, a man who inspired millions with his call for a world that was more just, more equitable, and more peaceful.
His New Frontier vision wasn't just a campaign slogan, it was a plan for a better future. A future where America would lead through service, innovation, and working together, not just through military strength. But his untimely death, it just tragically cut so much of that potential short.
Yeah, and even though it wasn't fully realized, the New Frontier vision still speaks to us today. Kennedy's focus on education, individual responsibility, and global engagement, those ideas are still relevant to the problems we're facing in the 21st century.
It's like his words, his ideals, they reach beyond the limits of time and circumstance. They speak to something deep inside us, a yearning for a world where we strive for something bigger than ourselves, a world where we all work together to overcome challenges that seem impossible.
Absolutely. And maybe that's why the JFK assassination still fascinates and haunts us. It's not just a tragic loss. It also reminds us of what could have been. It gives us a glimpse into a future that never quite became reality.
It's this powerful mix of sadness, curiosity, and longing for a path that wasn't taken. And it forces us to confront some tough questions about power, accountability, and the fragility of democracy.
It reminds us that history is not just a bunch of facts and dates. It's an active force that shapes who we are today and what our future will be. And by engaging with it critically, by asking questions, and by seeking truth, we can honor John F. Kennedy's legacy and work towards a future that reflects his vision of a new frontier.
That's beautiful. But honestly, I'm still struggling with the darker side of this whole story. The inconsistencies, the things that seem to be covered up, and the feeling that there's something more to the story than what we've been told. It's like trying to catch a shadow. It just keeps slipping away.
You know, maybe that's part of what makes the JFK assassination so powerful. It's a story that resists simple answers, a puzzle with missing pieces, a mystery that continues to unfold as we learn more and as we dig deeper.
It's a reminder that searching for the truth is a never-ending journey, one that requires us to be watchful, skeptical, and willing to face uncomfortable realities.
You said it, and while we might never solve the whole JFK assassination puzzle, the act of trying to understand, of grappling with its complexities, it speaks volumes about our desire to make sense of the world around us and find our place in it.
This deep dive has definitely been a roller coaster ride. Lots of twists and turns, moments of intrigue, and times where we've had to be really skeptical. We've examined evidence, considered theories, and really felt the weight of history. But I think throughout it all, we've come to a deeper understanding of not only the JFK assassination, but also the power of truth and the importance of always looking for it, even when it seems impossible.
Well said. The JFK assassination, with all its complexity and controversy, is a story that's still unfolding, a puzzle that might never be fully solved. But by engaging with the mysteries, asking questions, and being open to new ideas, we honor the memory of John F. Kennedy and the legacy he left behind.
Okay, so as we move into the final part of our deep dive, I think it's time to shift our focus to the wider implications of the JFK assassination. We've explored a lot of details, but now let's think about how this tragic event shaped how Americans thought and felt, how it changed our relationship with the government and those in authority, and what lessons we can learn from it as we face the challenges of our own time.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the Kennedy assassination.
We've really gone deep, haven't we? I mean, from all those details at the crime scene to the big picture politics at the time. But as we kind of wrap up these articles from Kennedy Assassination Chronicles, I keep thinking about the lasting impact. Did it change America? Not just, the politics, but like culturally too.
That's a really good question to think about. The JFK assassination, it wasn't just some news story. It was a huge turning point. It really shook people's faith in institutions, in the idea that the world was safe and predictable.
We talked about that loss of innocence earlier, but can you say more about that? Like, how did things change in America after November 22nd, 1963?
Well, think about it. Before the assassination, there was this feeling, especially during Kennedy's time, of optimism, progress, that whole new frontier thing we talked about. But seeing their young, charismatic president shot down in broad daylight, it made a lot of Americans feel vulnerable. Like suddenly they realized that even the most powerful people weren't safe from violence and chaos.
Yeah, it's like a crack appeared in this idea of American exceptionalism. Suddenly America, the city on a hill, felt exposed, like it could be hurt by the same bad things that happened in other parts of the world.
Right. And that feeling of vulnerability, of disillusionment, it kind of seeped into the culture. You see it in the art, the music, the writing from that time. There's a sense of cynicism and distrust, especially towards the government, because a lot of people felt like the government failed to protect Kennedy and then couldn't even give a good explanation for why he died.
And that distrust, that cynicism, it hasn't really gone away, has it? It seems like the JFK assassination started this trend of being more critical and questioning of those in charge, and that's still going on today.
For sure, it planted the seeds of skepticism. Conspiracy theories started popping up everywhere, not just about the assassination itself, but about all sorts of events and institutions and people in power. People began looking for hidden motives, for things happening behind the scenes that they weren't being told about.
So you could say that the JFK assassination forced Americans to become more aware, to be more careful about the information they were being given. They couldn't just accept the official story at face value anymore. They had to dig deeper, question things, and come to their own conclusions.
Exactly. The assassination and all the debate that came after it, it forced people to think critically, to analyze evidence in way different viewpoints. It made people realize that they had a responsibility to hold those in power accountable.
And that idea is still important today, right? I mean, we're constantly bombarded with information. A lot of it's not even true. We had to use those critical thinking skills that were, kind of sharpened by events like the JFK assassination to navigate this world of information overload and figure out how to make good decisions.
I think so. The JFK assassination reminds us to be skeptical, question authority, and to always look deeper. It shows us that history isn't set in stone. It's a conversation that's always changing, a constant process of looking back and reevaluating what we thought we knew.
It's kind of empowering in a way. It tells us that we're not just passive bystanders in history. We can actually shape how it's understood and remembered. And we can take that responsibility with us as we interact with the world.
It's about understanding that the search for truth never really ends. It's a journey, a constant process of questioning and looking for a deeper understanding. And the JFK assassination, with all its mysteries and unanswered questions, really emphasizes that.
Well, it seems like we've come full circle. We started out trying to understand the JFK assassination, and now we're talking about the nature of history itself, what truth is, and what role we play in all of it.
You got it. That's the legacy of the JFK assassination. It's an event that still challenges us, still fascinates us, and reminds us that the past isn't really gone, it still lives with us, shaping our present and future.
Thanks for joining us on this journey. Keep exploring, keep asking those questions, and never give up the search. The truth, even though it might be hard to find, it's out there somewhere.